Now this is a continuation of the lesson on graphing sine and cosine functions, and now we're going to look at cosine. It might appear that it's basically the same shape or the same graph as sine functions, but there's a slight difference. Cosine functions, it doesn't start at the origin. Cosine functions, it starts at the maximum or the amplitude. So we're not going to start at the origin, but we're going to start at the amplitude. Cosine functions, it touches the x-axis not at the period and half of a period, but on the other 2 points. Cosine function, it touches the x-axis at 1/4 of the period and 3/4 of the periods. So this is 1/4 and this is 3/4. So there's a small difference there. In sine functions, we touch the x-axis at a period and half of a period. Here on the cosine everything is get flipped. The cosine, it touches on 1/4 and 3/4, which is what we have here. And now the cosine has a max and a min at the period and half of a period. So the period is 2 pi and half of a period is pi. So the same points, but it's just that the graph, it takes a different shape. It doesn't start at the origin, but it starts at cosine, where we used to have where the graph for sine used to touch the x-axis. Now it becomes our max and a min, and where there was a max and a min, it becomes our x-axis. Now it touches the x-axis there, so everything gets flipped in a sense. So we're still going to use the same strategy. We're going to find those 5 key points, graph them, and then we're going to apply the properties for the cosine as to how the graph is going to look like. So let's start. Let's look. The amplitude, let's find the amplitude, which is the number in front of the function, which is just 2. So that's straightforward. Now let's find the period. Oops. All right. So now the period, we know that the period is 2 pi over b. But now in this case, we're going to have 2 pi over, or b right here is 4. So that means that the period for this function is 2 pi over 4, which simplifies to just pi over 2. So we find our period. Now let's find the period, 1/4 of the period of the function. So we're going to get the period of the function, which is pi over 2. And now we're going to multiply by 1/4. So now this becomes pi over 8. Now let's graph one half of the period. Let's get the period of the function that we found out, which was pi over 2. Now we're going to multiply this by 1/2. So that means that half of the period is just pi over 4. Okay, so now what we need to find out now is just 3/4 of a period. So let's get the full period that we found for the function, pi over 2. And now we need to multiply this by 3/4. So now we end up with 3 pi over 8. We got the key points. Let's graph them now, or let's place them on the graph. Now let's start with the amplitude. The amplitude is 2. Let's say 2 squares each one, so that's 1. So that's 2. Now let's place our points. Full period all the way in the end, which we found it to be pi over 2. Half of a period right here in the middle, which we found it to be pi over 4. 1/4 of the period, which is right here, which is half of a half, which we found to be pi over 8. 3/4, which we found to be 3 pi is over 8. So now let's do the same here, but now for the negative points. All the way on the right, we're going to have negative 1/2, negative pi over 2. Right here in the middle, we're going to have negative pi over 4. 1/4, negative pi over 8. And 3/4 is negative 3 pi over 8. Excellent. So we got everything. We got our axes, we got our points. So now we're ready to graph. So what do I know about the cosine function? The cosine function doesn't start at the origin, but the cosine function starts at the max. Then my next point is going to be touching the x-axis. Then my next point is going to be the min. My next point is an x-axis again. And my next point, it's a max. And the same goes for the other side. If you start the origin, your next point has to pass through the x-axis. The next point is your min. The next point, x-axis again. The next point, it's a max. We got those points. So now what we have to do here is now we graph. We just connect them. One thing that is important to say is that make sure that your graph has some kind of curvature. Okay, maybe this is not the best graph, but you get an idea. When we graph in sine and cosine functions, please don't do this. When we connect those points, there needs to be some curvature right here at the edges. It cannot be a straight line. So there it is. That's how we graph a cosine function. It's still the same idea here, but it's just that we don't start at 0, but we start at the maximum. Let's show you one more example now. Again, if you want to graph it, if you want to graph sine or cosine, you need to know those 5 points. So let's find them. Now let's start with the amplitude. Here, amplitude, we see that the number in front of the function is -3. So that says that the amplitude is always positive, so it's just 3. Here we see that the period, again, is 2 pi over b, which we have 2 pi, but here b is just 2, so we have 2 pi over 2, which just becomes pi. Because here the 2's will cancel out. 1/4 of the period, so we're going to have pi multiply by 1/4. So that's going to give me pi over 4. Now again, how do I get that? If you have a number, you can always divide that by an imaginary 1. And now it becomes pi times 1, pi. 1 times 4, 4. So now let's get 1/2 of the period. So let's get the period, which we found it to be pi. Now we multiply that by 1/2. So this becomes pi over 2. Now let's find 3/4 of the period. So let's get the period, which is pi. We're going to get that, and we're going to multiply by 3/4, which it becomes 3 pi over 4. Excellent. So we got our points here. Let's make our axis. Let's start with the amplitude. The amplitude is 3, so each square is 1 now. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so that's our max and min. So now let's start with the period. The period was all the way in at the end, which we find it to be pi. So it says that right here at the center, we're going to have half of a period, which is pi over 2. And half of a half, which is right here. That's 1/4, and 1/4 of the period, which found it to be pi over 4. And 3/4 of the period, which found it to be 3 pi over 4. Let's do the same for now for the x-axis, for the negative points. So all the way in the eye. So we have negative pi right here in the middle. We have one half of a period, which is exactly negative. Well, we find to be 1/2 or pi over 2, but we're on the x negative points. Half of a half, 1/4, which we find to be pi over 4, which is negative. And right here is 3/4, so that's negative 3 pi over 4. All right, so that's excellent. So now, what do we know about our graph? It's always going to start at the top. Then the next point is the x-axis. Then the next point, it's a minimum. Then the next point is the axis. Then the next point is a max. And we're going to do the same for the negative points. Next is axis. Next is min. Next is axis. Next is min. So we got our points now. So what do? We just graph them. Again, try to make your graph in a curve shape. Well, let's try that again. We're almost there. Oops. All right. So this is the graph for the cosine function. So now, here's your entrance ticket. Try to graph the following.